introduction. I'm happy to be here today. I really like doing threat assessments. I've done a bunch of these throughout my career. In fact, Malin has my cell phone number, which I guess is good or bad. She calls me late one evening and said, "Hey, Perry, I've got this friend in Washington, D.C. that's getting threats." And I'm thinking, call somebody in Washington, D.C. But anyway, the guy called me the next day and emailed me a threat that he'd received by email concerning one of his kids. It was, one kid sent an email saying he was going to kill or hurt this other guy's child. But anyway, I like doing those. It's a break from my budget spreadsheets and things like that, so I really like doing that. I'll kind of give you the brief history of how I really got involved in all this. When I was a little boy, both of my grandparents lived in a little town in Oklahoma called Tecumseh, Oklahoma. And so I learned to be a diplomat because when we'd go to Tecumseh to see the grandparents, we had to figure out which one do you go to first, which is the one that you leave from last, where do you have Christmas dinner, where do you open presents, all that kind of stuff. So I kind of learned to be a diplomat negotiator there. And when I got out of college, I started buying oil and gas leases. So I'm taking farmers and trying to talk them into giving us their land so we can tear it up and mine coal or drill oil wells or something like that. So that was, kind of interesting for me. Then I got tired of doing that and went to work at the police department. And I remember being in the academy, and there was an FBI agent teaching us something, and he had kind of run out of material that day, but still had an hour or so, and he said, "Well, what do y'all want to talk about?" And I remember him saying that he was a FBI hostage negotiator. And I said, "Well, I'm interested in that. Tell us about that." So he talked about that for a little bit, and I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. And a couple of years later, I got to help form our department's hostage negotiation team. We didn't have one back then. We had a SWAT team, but no negotiators. So I got to help create that. That prompted me to really think about, how do people get in these crises? What are they thinking about? How can we do a better job talking them out of these real desperate situations? So I went back to school and started studying psychology, got a degree in psychology, and that led to me being a professional student the rest of my life. So I've had a lot of interesting experiences negotiating with people. As a negotiator, one of the things you have to do is we call them indirect personality assessments. Figure out, hey, what makes this person tick? What's going on with them? Why are they in this crisis? How can I help them? So I've been fortunate to go to some Secret Service training in Washington, D.C. I've been to the FBI Academy twice for 2 different training programs. I'm fortunate to know several retired FBI profile agents and talk to them at least every month about things. So I've had a lot of experience, a lot of training in this, and I really like sharing that information with everybody. And so that's what we're going to do today. Is we're going to talk about school violence, how we can get a handle on that, and really for us, how to manage that. I think everybody has a story, and I want to hear some of them today, about some kid in your school that you're probably worried about. And so you've already done a threat assessment on them, haven't you? You know there's somebody you ought to watch. And so what we want to do is use our resources to try to manage that threat, reduce the chance that they may actually be violent in school. And so we'll talk about some of that today. I was telling Malin that when I got through with class yesterday, I went to the office and I'm checking all the emails I have, and there was one email that was it's a legal update that we get all the time, and it talked about a new Supreme Court ruling that just came out in the last 2 or 3 days. It has to do with search and seizure But it was interesting because the officers that, this case involves school violence. These officers get information that a kid at school has written a letter and given it to the school saying, I'm going to come shoot the school up. And now this kid's been absent from school a couple of days, so everybody's kind of worried about what's going on with this kid. And so several officers out in California go to this child's house to check on him. And they knock on the door. Nobody answers the door. They call the phone inside the house. They can hear it ringing. Nobody answers. They call Mom's cell phone, and she answers. And she says, I'm at home. And they said, you know why we're here? No, I don't. Well, come out. And so eventually she and her son come out, and the kind of the Supreme Court issue was, they're asking her, what's up with your son? And he's there with her now. So they're both outside. And she said, I don't know. I don't know why you're here. And they said, do you have any guns in the house? And she doesn't say anything, but she turns and runs back in the house. Well, that kind of causes the police some concern, and they run in the house after her, not knowing if she's going to go grab a gun or whatever. And that was kind of the Supreme Court issue. The lower court said, the police were wrong. They shouldn't have run in the house. And the Supreme Court said, no, the police had ample reason to fear for their safety and others' safety. And so all they did was run in, kind of make sure that she didn't grab a gun. They didn't search anything. And so anyway, I thought that was an interesting case, just timing-wise for this class, that case was a case involving potential school violence. And it turned out, after the officers did a threat assessment, they didn't think that kid posed a threat. There weren't any guns in the house. He apparently didn't write this letter, and so that ended up to be, no risk, just bad information. So, and I think a lot of even though this class is about risk assessment and we all think about the worst case scenario, the vast majority of incidents that we do risk assessments on, we're going to figure out those are kind of low risk. They're, the kids aren't really planning on doing anything. They don't have the means to do that. But we're going to, jump through all those hoops and just make sure that that we're aware of the risk and are managing that. So I thought we'd start out by just talking about some incidents of school violence. Look at the date on this. This is not a mistake. This is the earliest incident of school violence in the United States that I can find. This was back in 1764, where some Lapine Indians attacked a school on the Pennsylvania frontier. They killed 10 students and wounded 2 students. So that's school violence. 1898, an 8-year-old grammar student stabbed an 8-year-old classmate to death. 1989, in Canada, a student opened fire in 4 different locations in a 6-story building. He killed 14 people and wounded 13. Then he committed suicide. One of the things that we've noticed as workplace violence and school violence has kind of stepped into the forefront in media coverage is that in workplace violence, we're talking about adults, typically those end in suicide. There's probably 3 ways one of these incidents can end. What's one way? Well, we have somebody, either workplace violence or school violence, and they go in and they start shooting people. Okay, suicide is one way. The offender commits suicide. What's another way? The offender gets killed by somebody. Okay, what's the third outcome? They can just give up. Okay, and so what we've noticed in workplace violence with adults is a lot of times they will commit suicide. It's fairly rare, not unheard of though, but rare that they either give up or are shot by police. Most of the time when they're confronted, they're going to commit suicide. In school violence, most of the time, those kids don't commit suicide. They, a lot of times, give up. There have been several incidents where I think after those kids expend all that violent energy, I've seen school principals or school officials walk up and say, "Put that gun down," and they will. And there have been others where they've been attacked by other students while they're reloading a gun or something like that. Now, that's fairly risky behavior, and it's not my intent today to try to teach you how to deal with that violence when it's occurring in a school. But one of the things that we've learned in law enforcement about this is either workplace violence or school violence, if we press the offender, and we've changed our tactics, we've learned a lot. Even one officer pursuing that offender is going to terminate their violence. They're either going to give up or commit suicide. They rarely engage in a gunfight with the police. If you think about the incidents that you've heard about on TV, very few of those turn into any kind of protracted gun battle with the police. That's not what they want to do. 1992. Eric Houston killed 4 students and wounded 10 at a California high school. He was arrested by police. September 1992, a 17-year-old student shot 6 classmates at a pep rally. A 7th student was trampled at Paladura High School in Amarillo. Anybody remember that incident? Okay, well, you were there. What happened? Mm-hmm. Yeah, he ran off, and I think it was some school officials that followed him out. Okay, yeah. Who else was there? What do you remember about that? Right, out, yeah.
And he ran and hid in the backyard a couple of blocks away behind the bush.
Right. Okay. Anybody remember why that took place, that shooting? Yes.
He was intimidated by a brother of a girl that he was courting, and he was frightened.
Okay. So he was bullied. And who is his intended target? Okay. Anybody else? Anybody know? What I recall is his target, I think, was the girlfriend's brother, and he missed that target. That person was uninjured, and several other people were shot. Fortunately, not seriously. Yeah. Okay. What else do you remember about that incident? Okay, chaos. Were there a lot of parents there?
Parents were showing up, pulling their kids out. We had kids on the lower floor and main building lined up.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to clear the hallways that lead to restore some sort of sanity. And there was a lot of confusion as to what really was going on.
Exactly.
Like Sam said, it was just after a pep rally. The kids were already kind of hyper.
Right.
Kind of milling around.
Mm-hmm.
Classes hadn't begun yet. So it happened at a really bad time.
Yeah, as I recall, somehow local radio stations found out about that, either through monitoring police radios or something like that. So on the FM radio, they're saying there's a shooting at Paladura and students are injured. What does every parent in town do? Beeline to school. And so, yes, the school was kind of overwhelmed with parents wanting to know, where's my child? Well, where were all the kids? They're not in class. Nobody knew where all the kids were. Really, nobody knew exactly who was hurt and at the hospital. Yes. So it's worse now. It's worse. Okay. Yeah. So, so that's big news. That's big news, and parents react to that. So, and parents are wanting to take kids out of school. As school administrators, what are you trying to do? Figure out account for all the kids. Okay. So it was a huge, just a huge mess, because kids are leaving campus on their own. Some of them are being hauled off by ambulances. Parents are hauling some off. And I'm not sure there's a good way to handle a situation like that, because you get all those parents up there and they want their kids, and they don't care what little system that is in place to try to impose some order. Okay, so we've had an incident here in Amarillo. 1996. A 14-year-old kid killed 3 classmates and wounded 1 before being arrested in a Washington middle school. 1998, 2 young boys, 11 and 13, killed 4 students and a teacher before surrendering in Jonesboro, Arkansas. How many of you are principals? Do you think you're a symbolic target in a school violence incident? Yes, you are. If you're shaking your head no, you're in denial. Yes, you are. Yes, you are. Okay. 1999. Harrison in Klebold killed 12 students and 1 teacher. 160 other students were given some form of first aid. 24 were sent to hospitals, and this, of course, occurred at Columbine High School in Colorado. We learned a lot. When I say we, I think school officials learned a lot. Police learned a lot. At this time, what was the standard police response to any kind of guy with a gun call, shooting? You bet. We always used our SWAT tactics that had evolved, and they worked great in most hostage incidents or barricaded gunman incident. What you do is you lock the scene down so the guy can't escape and nobody can get in. You call negotiators, and we start talking to the bad guy, getting him calmed down, where their rational thought. Rational thinking increases, and then we lower their stressors, and they give up and come out. Well, in an active shooting incident like Columbine, that doesn't work. All that does is give the bad guy more time to shoot people. And so we have developed a totally different response for that, active shooter response. And what the police do now is hopefully in pairs, but as soon as you get to the scene, you try to find out where's that gunman, and you run to them, and you run past wounded individuals, and you just kind of run headlong into the fight, kind of knowing once we press the fight to them, what's going to happen. They're either going to give up or they're going to commit suicide, but they're not going to be shooting people anymore. So that's kind of, so our police response has evolved from that. That's one of the things that law enforcement learned and really took to heart and changed tactics. In February 2000, a 6-year-old took a .32 caliber pistol to school and killed a 6-year-old classmate in Ohio. 2010, the school principal was shot and killed by a custodian in California. Now, is this school violence, or would we think this is really workplace violence? Yeah. February 2011, a special education teacher was shot and killed by a man infatuated with her. The police later shot and killed him in Tacoma, Washington. So again, this is an incident that occurred in a school setting, but it's really kind of traditional workplace violence. January 2011, a 17-year-old student was suspended for destruction of property. He returned to school and shot and killed the principal and the vice principal in Nebraska. Thanks. Could this happen in any school? Could this happen in one of our schools? Okay, so this is again kind of what our threat assessment training and protocol is all about. Now here's a kind of interesting list. These are the most dangerous jobs. Law enforcement's at the top of the list. Why would mental health be on this list? Okay, because in psychological terms, mental health people work with nuts, right? Okay. Retail sales. Think convenience stores. Okay. Teaching. My goodness, I thought teaching was a safe occupation, like being an accountant. But it's really not, is it? Okay. Transportation. Think taxi driver. Or pizza delivery guy who will drive to the scene of the robbery. Okay. And then the medical profession. ER staff. They have some interesting experiences where there's a drive-by shooting or something like that, and so the victim and the victim's family go there, and then the offender and his family may go there also. You have both factions there. So those are some dangerous jobs, and teaching unfortunately made that list. Now, what I want to go over for the next hour or so is some information that was developed by the Secret Service in partnership with the Department of Education. Especially after Columbine, everybody really got seriously interested in school violence. Why is that occurring? Can we predict school violence? Can we prevent that? And so the Secret Service thought, hey, we will use our expertise in threat assessment that we have for presidential and other dignitary protection and see if we can apply that to these school shootings. Prior to this, the Secret Service had undertaken a kind of a major research project, and they looked at all the previous presidential assassinations. And so they said, can we find anything about the behavior, personality, things like that of these assassins that would help us identify future assassins? And so that's why they undertook the study. One interesting thing they found in their presidential assassin study was no assassin had ever written a letter to the White House saying, I'm going to kill the President of the United States. None of them ever did that. So they gained a lot of information from that, and they thought, well, we'll apply that model to school shootings and see what we can find. So the Secret Service, when they published their results, they said, some of these attacks may be preventable. Kind of depends on if we have information and we do an assessment and react to that. Obviously, we can prevent some of those. Threat assessment involves efforts to first identify that somebody poses a threat. Usually that's, how are we going to get that? How do y'all find out that some kid may be threatening? How have you found out before, ma'am? A student tells you, okay? How about you? Yes, ma'am, you. I like that. Me? Okay, you bet. And have you found students that are doing that? Okay. So that's kind of proactive. When the students are telling us, that's good information. And so when we get that, then we have to assess that. Is this a real threat, or is this kid just being a kid? Being a dumb kid. And then if we find out, there's a threat and this kid worries us, well then how do we manage that threat? How do we kind of contain this? How do we keep this kid from actually coming to school and shooting the school up? What us law enforcement guys do in that case? How do we prevent that? Throw them in jail. But what's the problem with that? They get out of jail. Okay. And where do they go when they get out of jail? Right back to school. So, in some cases, arrest may not be a good solution to that. Sometimes it's a good temporary solution, but it may not be a good long-term solution. So we've got to figure out a way to manage those threats. And kind of as an aside, I'll tell you a story. I was at a workplace violence workshop taught by a retired FBI profiler, and he kind of goes around advising all these businesses, how to set up kind of the same protocols we're setting up here. And this one business, a huge national business, contract with him and said, "Hey, we think we have a problem." He said, "Okay." He said, "We've got this guy that works in IT, and he runs all of our company computer systems. And so there's so much data in there. If we ever lost that data, we'd go bankrupt. If the computer system were attacked." And he said, "This guy's a typical geek. He's real good at computers. He has no social skills, and we're going to have to fire him because he keeps inappropriately interacting with our female employees, and they're complaining. So we're going to have to get rid of him, and we're somewhat concerned that when we fire him, he might destroy our computer system, which would basically destroy our business. So tell us how to solve this problem." And so Dr. Depew, he says, "Okay," and he comes out there and talks to him and kind of assesses the situation. Said, "Here's what we're going to do. We're not going to fire this employee. We are going to let them out of their contract with us so that they can advance in the computer world and achieve the greatness that they could if they weren't limited by our company." Okay? And we're going to do that by giving him a generous severance package, and we're going to hire a staff to help groom him and apply with all these other companies so he can get a much higher paying job than he has now. Okay? And that's what they did. And so they fired this guy, but made it look like a big, business opportunity for him. So he left the company. Now he's somebody else's problem. And their company's still up and running, the computer system's fine and all that stuff. So that's an example of creative management of a threat. And that's what we want to kind of continue to do in here, maybe in a more formalized way. Now, the Secret Service examined 37 instances of targeted school violence in that 15 or 16 year date range. So that's where their data comes from. And kind of the key to this, when school shootings really became prominent, Jonesboro, Arkansas, and some others right after that, everybody wanted a profile of a school shooter. Can anybody tell me what the profile of a school shooter is, or what some of the characteristics are? I'm sorry, what? Clothing. Okay. So what do they wear? What do school shooters wear? Trench coats, right? Dark colored trench coats, okay. All the shooters wear dark, no, what are the characteristics, the profile? They're a human being, okay. That helps me a little bit. Okay.
There's really not a profile, is
There really is no profile. Early on, some experts were saying, okay, all these kids are picked on in school, and they have low grades, and they're all drunks or using dope. And that was the profile. But then all of a sudden we're seeing shootings where, hey, this kid makes good grades, and he's not really bullied. So what's up with that? So there really is no profile. That would make it very easy, to identify our school shooters. Okay, you got a trench coat, and you're a human being. Okay, you're out of here. There have been a couple instances, one in New Mexico 4 or 5 years ago, I think, where a girl brought a gun to school and shot and killed another student. But, when you look at violence as a whole, men are predominant in that. I think the last real good study I read said, about if you look at violent crime, 85% of the offenders are male, 15% are female. Now that's changed because kind of society is changing over time. For instance, in suicide, women in the past would rarely use a gun to commit suicide. Now you see a few more of those. In fact, that used to be a kind of a red flag for us. If we were at a equivocal death scene, female and gunshot, and the gun was there, it looks like a suicide, statistically we knew, that's not impossible, but it's very rare, so we want to investigate those homicides. So, yeah, primarily men. Kind of in workplace violence, everybody wants a profile for workplace violence. So here is the profile for workplace violence. It is a male, typically between 21 and 55 years old. Not a lot of help, right? Okay, so, what the Secret Service is going to focus on is really behavior. And that's kind of the key to this, is behavior, because you can't just look at one type of person or one profile for a person and say if they meet this profile, they're going to be a school shooter, and if they don't meet it, they won't be. Not that easy. There was a real good book written about statistical prediction of violence, back in the 1980s by, I think, a guy named Monahans or something like that I've read. And basically what he said was, if you think of rare events, school shootings, suicide, for example, and then you try to predict that with any kind of scientific accuracy, what you're doing is you have just a small number of incidents and millions of non-incidents. And so statistically, it's just impossible to predict those violent incidents with any degree of accuracy whatsoever. So you have to look at behavior. And behavior is going to be kind of the key for us. Now, even though this class is about violence, and that's what you see on TV, what's the reality? The reality is our schools are pretty safe. Most kids are going to go through school without ever having a real violent encounter. Schools are still safe, even though the media, kind of hypes that up, and so it makes you think, oh my gosh, there are school shootings every day. Hundreds of kids are being shot, things like that. It just doesn't happen. I've been a police officer 33 years. Tell me how many people that you think that I've shot or shot at in 33 years. How many? 5? Heard somebody say 1? Yeah, Vern's right. 0. I've never shot my gun at anybody. And that's typical for most of us. It's typical. We spend all this time, money, and effort shooting at targets, buying ammo and stuff like that, and never get to shoot anybody. So it's kind of like school. You know, we sometimes we prepare for the worst, but the reality is, you know, the worst could happen. It sure could, and that's why we want to be prepared. But the reality is, you know, it does not happen a lot. This is a statistic I got several years ago. I'm sure the numbers have changed. 60 million children attend 100,000 schools in the United States. Anybody have an update on any of those figures? That's a lot. That's a lot of kids and a lot of schools. I was impressed. Malin and I and Dr. Angels, some other people went out to Las Vegas to look at their school district and how they deal with school violence and things like that. And I think they told us, and this was just a couple of years ago, you know, when the economy had kind of turned, and they were building, I think it was one new school a year. Every year, one new school in their school district. Huge. Now, one of the things the Secret Service said, and I think, and we're all learning from this, that environments, or you know, think of school settings where everybody kind of pays attention to the social and emotional needs of their students. You have fewer situations that are really going to rise to a threat assessment. In other words, if the school staff, the teachers, if they're paying attention to kids other than education, you know, what's going on in this kid's life, how are they interacting with other kids at school, perhaps even what's going on at home. And I think you all do that. I really do think that in our school system we do that. Then you're kind of getting ahead of the game. You're beginning to you know, assess potential risk in those kids and perhaps offer resources to them either through the school or through other community avenues for them to solve problems and not let you know, their challenges overwhelm them where they resort to violence. Y'all think this is true? You think you have more kids in school that just have like cruddy lives than you have violence at school? You know, I think that's true, and I've told Malin that I think in a year, Malin and all the counseling staff are going to hate me, because I would think what would happen is you start doing threat assessments. You know, those are going to turn out to be low risk, but you're going to find, God, this kid really needs, you know, counseling for problems and things like that. So the counseling staff's going to be overwhelmed. You know, their caseload's going to double or triple. They're going to think, what in the world happened to us this year? But I think they'll see more referrals from this. So, you know, when we're doing threat assessments, we're really being reactive, aren't we? Some kids posed a threat, now we have to deal with that. And I think what this slide says is, and again, I think in our school system we do a good job, but if we can try to address other needs of students, social needs, trying to take care of family needs, I know we do that, like working with Evelyn Rivers and in other projects, then you're actually managing potential risk. You're not letting some of those kids' risk level rise to the level that we have to do risk assessments on them. Now, this is, again, something that we're kind of learning, especially after Columbine and some other school incidents, is the schools have to develop means to know that there's a threat out there. Now, what means do we have in our school system to do that? How can students, you know, one of the things that this study showed was that in a lot of school systems, there's kind of like a code of silence among the students. You know, we kind of know something's going to happen, but we're not going to tell anybody because that's not cool. So how do y'all make this cool for students to tell you about potential violence? Crime Stoppers is one way. Excellent. Okay. Are there any other ways? Okay. So develop an individual rapport. Okay. That's good. That's one of the things Secret Service said we ought to do. Any other things? Do you have little, like, anonymous drop boxes or something like that for, okay, that's another way. Okay. And so, I think we kind of have to constantly work on telling students that they have an obligation. If they know that some other student's going to harm themselves or harm somebody else, the right thing to do, the thing that they have an obligation to do is tell us so that we can prevent that from happening. So we have to kind of constantly work on that. And so if we do all those things, then we can do our threat assessment. But again, kind of the big deal is we have to be made aware of that threat. So here's some findings of the Secret Service study on school shootings. People don't just twist off. And that was the big one. If you think about what you see on television, there'll be some guy that, kills 2 or 3 people, kills his family, or some kid goes to school, shoots the school up, and then the news media is interviewing family or friends, and what do they all say? Such a nice kid, just a model family. Who would have thunk it, right? Well, those people are dumb. They don't know that individual. I mean, that's really what's happening. People do not just, a nonviolent person, a person that's gone through their life, and they don't engage in violent acts, criminal activity, things like that. They just don't snap one day and do that. When we go back and look at them, you can see kind of a history of, if it's not overt acts, it's at least a fantasy or a fascination with violence. Does anybody remember a murder in New York City? And I think it maybe was in Central Park, the Preppy murder. Anybody remember that? What do you remember about that? What's the storyline on that? Yeah. Yeah. Now, what kind of sex? What did he say? Listen to this for we love this in interrogation. I picked this girl up in a bar, took her to a park, and we were having rough sex, and she died. Yeah. God, man, you got the worst luck ever. But people were fascinated by that story because the homicide defendant wasn't some thuggy-looking guy. He was kind of affluent, dressed nice, preppy kind of guy. So, gosh, nice people don't commit murder. But when you looked at his background, he'd been arrested for burglary, I think some thefts or fraud or something like that. So he didn't have the pristine background that everybody thought that he did. So, but we find this story repeated constantly in multiple homicide or multiple shooting deals where everybody's shocked that happened. But people don't twist off. They leave us clues, behaviors. And that in risk assessment, that's what we're going to look at. That's what's going to make somebody high risk or maybe low risk. That's how we differentiate between the dumb school kid that just said, hey, I'm going to come kill you, that's not going to carry that out, versus another kid that says that has this track record of violence, track record of infatuation with violence and things like that. That's the kid that worries me. He gets a higher risk assessment. This is important. Prior to most of these school shooting incidents, other people knew about the attacks or the plan for attack. I remember after one shooting, and I think it was in Mississippi, maybe Pearl, Mississippi, I can't remember now, but there had been a school shooting one morning, and the next morning I'm getting ready for work, and I'm watching the Today Show, and the reporters are interviewing some students from that high school where the shooting took place. And these kids are saying, oh yeah, we were all gathered up in this little area because we had heard something was going to happen. They had heard there was going to be a shooting, and what did they do? Hey, cool, let's go watch, instead of telling somebody. Okay, and then the next day it was, Sheriff's Department investigates all these witnesses who knew about the shooting and didn't do anything. That's called leakage. In our business, that's called leakage. Is there anybody in here that likes race cars? Okay, so when you do you drive a race car looking vehicle? Okay, all right, good. Okay, do you like to talk to other people about racing? Okay, well, I need you to come out of the closet. Help me out. If I'm real interested in something, I like to talk about that. I'm interested in other people who have similar ideas. And that's leakage. I spend a lot of time thinking about this. It interests me, and so that's how I spend my time, money, and effort. So if I'm mad at the school, mad at everybody in the school, angry, and I want to kill them, and that's what I think about all the time, that leaks out in my drawings. I don't draw race cars then. I draw what? Guns, death, people being shot, blood coming out of them, all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And with my friends, what do I talk about? I'm so mad at school I could kill everybody. That's leakage. The more intently I think about that, that kind of consumes more and more of my life. And so I'm talking to people about that. And so when I go talk to Vern and Dale, I come in and I say, Dadgum, I'm sick to death of work. All I do is work on a spreadsheet all day and numbers and budget, and I'm sick, and I think I want to kill everybody. And Vern will say, Perry, I wouldn't do that if I were you. And I go, oh, okay, yeah, that's a good idea. Now I go talk to Braz. Braz says, yeah, that's what I'd do. But I'd get them all. Okay, so we'll talk about in a minute, the friends of this person are going to be interesting for us, because if they're good friends like Vern, what's that doing to risk? Lowering the risk. If they're hanging out with Braz, oh my gosh, we're in trouble. Okay. Now, look at this. Just like our presidential assassins, most school attackers did not directly threaten their targets. In other words, they didn't come up and say, tomorrow I'm going to shoot you, most of the time. Now, do you think the intended victim knows there's some conflict between us? Probably. But they haven't been put on notice that it's going to be deadly. They know there's conflict. But again, that leakage, now, when we talk about leakage, do you think that Vern might know who my intended target is? Yeah, I may have leaked that out to him. But I'm probably not directly confronting my target. Okay? If I were to confront my target, that would mean that I think I have either verbal or physical or some kind of skills, that I have a skill set to try to deal with that problem other than violence. Okay? So this kid doesn't have that skill set. So they're going to resort to violence. Now again, there's no accurate or useful profile of students who engage in workplace violence. There's really no profile for workplace violence. But I always trick everybody. Some of the classes I've taught, I'd say, okay, write down this profile. And I do they're male between, if it's school violence, they're between 6 and 19. And then some people come up and look at me like, well, hey, that's not real helpful. And they're getting the picture, okay? Now, most attackers, these are people that carried out school attacks, they engaged in some behavior that created a concern in somebody else. Either that's, drawing, pictures of shootings or something like that, leakage. It could be getting on the computer, looking, how do I make bombs, things like that. But their behavior's leaking out, and somebody sees that. Now, it's typical. A lot of times when we hear about a serious threat, what's probably the first thought that goes through your mind? It won't happen, right? It won't happen. And statistically, you're right. If I just had to make bets, I'd say, yeah, it probably won't be violent. So, let's call it denial. This isn't happening to me. How many people plan on having a traffic accident this month? None? That's denial. I mean, I hope nobody does, but nobody really plans on having a wreck, do they? So we've kind of got to keep an open mind when we're informed about this behavior. When it creates a concern, then we need to pay attention to that. Okay. Now, stressors. Anytime we're looking at doing an indirect personality assessment on somebody, we're always interested in stressors. Remember I said, people don't just snap. They don't turn from being a good person to a bad person in an instant. It's kind of a process. It's a road. But oftentimes on that road, they come to a certain point where now they're really getting engaged in violence, and something holds them back until what? They have one more stressor, kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. One more thing happened, now I just can't hold it together anymore. Okay? And then they step over that line and engage in violence. So we always want to know when we're doing an assessment, has this individual had any kind of stressor, any kind of setback in the recent past? A couple of days, week, something like that. It could actually be longer than that, but typically you've got a pretty short time span there. In some individuals, probably not in the school setting, but what Larry's asking is, does opportunity play a role in this? And if I can kind of change gears for a minute and go into profiling sexual offenders, there's 4 types of rapists, and one rapist, when they have a stressor, they get mad, they hate women, and literally walking around now with all this rage, and then the first woman they come across, woe be you. You'll be lucky to survive the attack. Other rapists kind of have here's what I'm looking for in a victim. They have really a profile. Certain age, all that kind of stuff. But in the school shooters, no. I mean, you don't really see that as opportunistic because the school's always there. Just whenever they decide to do it. In fact, some of them will wait for anniversary dates, or they're going to do planning because they want everything right. So it's as if, I'm going to do this, but I'm going to do it right. I'm going to plan it out. And there's some mental satisfaction with them in knowing that they're going to do this and nobody else knows. And they kind of replay it in their mind and things like that. And that's also mental rehearsal for them, which is kind of bad for us. Many attackers felt, I wanted to point out also, many of these school shooters had considered or even attempted suicide. So that's another marker that we look for when we're doing our background investigation in a risk assessment. If we see a suicide theme in there, then that's going to cause us some alarm. Many of these attackers felt bullied, and I think that's the kind of theme that we see throughout these. They feel like they're not a part of the school. They're kind of pushed out. They're on the fringe, and they think that that's, of course, unfair. And most attackers had access to weapons. Unfortunately, we live in West Texas. Everybody has guns. The few that don't have guns, their neighbors have plenty. So, we just figure any kid can get access to a gun. They're probably going to get it out of their home. And then again, part of this is leakage, but other students at least had knowledge. Some actually helped acquire weapons or research and things like that. So if we have a good intel system developed like we do, Crime Stoppers, the bullying boxes, things like that, then we're gathering that information. Unfortunately, if you don't have a school liaison officer in your school and you call 911 and say somebody's shooting in our school right now, it's going to be a few minutes before the first officer gets there. And a lot of these incidents, as I mentioned earlier, were stopped by either school officials or the kids gave up or other school kids jumped them when they were reloading or something like that. Again, there's some danger in that. Remember, when these kids are in any of these folks, when they're in their killing mode, when they've got all this pent-up rage and they're shooting, if you're a principal, don't think for a second you can come up there and say, I'm the principal of the school and you put that gun down right now. You'll probably be the next victim. What I would say is kind of think like physicians. Do no harm. Don't make this situation worse than it is. Perhaps you should focus your effort on saving the lives of those around you rather than, confronting the shooter and getting shot, and now, there's nobody available to lead everybody else to safety. Okay, let's take a break. We'll come back and talk more about this Secret Service study. Oh, the email from Washington? There it is.
Didn't know it was a poetry. I thought it was. I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Brandy Self. I'm Tim Williams' niece.
Okay.
Tim and my dad are brothers.
Okay. Nice to meet you. We're just crying that Tim... I know.
He loves his job.
Yeah. Well,